computer? Ah, thank you. It is recording. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I have the pleasure to introduce to you David Mathisen. David, thank you so much for accepting my invitation. I'm really
You,
very
Krasi.
enthusiastic. Thank you so much. I want to introduce you to the people who are new to my channel, who do not know you. First of all, I will start with what really amazed me. You've written 11 books, all on mythology. And also, you do exactly what I really love, and I'm so really impressed. You research mythology, and exactly you make this most beautiful connection, mythology and stars. So let me be a little bit more specific. So you are author and researcher on mythology. You explore the evidence that the ancient myths around the world are based on the stars, and that they are all use the same system of celestial metaphor. This is why, David, I invited you so that we make exactly this connection between, let's say, the mythology of Babylon, and the stars, but mainly to emphasize on the Egyptian mythology, because I know you're expert in this. So to make this connection, mythology, planets, stars, eventually, because all secrets are in mythology. They're not in the mythology are not fairy tales. There is where the truth is encoded. So let me continue, and then I give you the word. So what actually you do is so they all use the same system of celestial metaphor, in which the different characters and events in the myths correspond to specific constellations, such as the zodiac constellation, but also non-zodiac constellations. So this I love the most. These star myths include the stories in the Bible as well as the myths from all different continents and cultures. And yes, you've written 11 books, and I will place link under this video to your channel, because you have amazing videos on your channel. You also do some classes, and also to your books, of course. So all these myths will be under this video, so can people listen to your amazing videos. So David, I give the word to you. Thank you again.
Well, thank you so much, Krasi. And it's so nice to be here with you and with your different listeners around the world. And Ksenia says hello as well.
Ksenia, let me say, Ksenia is the wife of David. Everyone knows Ksenia. We're friends. We record often videos on astrology together.
That's the most important part of my bio, but thank you. And that was brought about, just amazing connections that brought Ksenia and I together. But
Yes.
thank you so much for having me, Krasi. I'm excited to talk about this subject with you, and you have so much knowledge about the Babylonian system and the stars and the ancient wisdom that is here for us to use, here to help us in this life. And that's what the myths, like you said, the myths are this precious treasure, this inheritance given to all the different cultures around the world. All different cultures have myths and sacred stories that go back into the ancient times that have been handed down, and they contain this wisdom for us that we need in this life. And it's connected to the stars. And so we'll talk about that today. But when I say that all the different stories in the myths are based on the stars, a lot of times people, I find, they nod their heads and they say, yes, of course, that makes sense. Of course, it's based on the stars. And then they say, well, what do you mean? Because it sounds so reasonable, but what exactly do I mean when I say that different myths are based on the stars? What I mean is that the actual figures, whether it is the gods and goddesses or the different characters in the stories of the Bible or in the sacred traditions of the Americas, there a lot of the stories there have been lost because of the invasions that happened and the destruction of their myths. But in their stories, the different figures in their stories, such as White Buffalo Woman from the Sioux or the Hero twins from the Maya, those figures themselves correspond to different specific constellations, and those constellation figures have the same characteristics around the world, just like you and your listeners know the characteristics of Venus for the planet Venus. What does Venus give to us? What are the characteristics of Venus? What is her influence? What about Mars? Well, the influence of Mars is known and understood in astrology and also in the mythology. There's a god named Mars, and the Romans called that god Mars, and the Greeks called that god Ares. But around the world, there are figures, there are gods who have those identifiable characteristics. And in the ancient times, there are ancient writers who, and I just talked about this in some of my most recent videos, these ancient writers who say, oh, well, the Germans, there was a Roman writer named Tacitus. And when the Romans were fighting the Germans, Tacitus wrote these books that are still in existence, these texts that you can read from Tacitus, this ancient Roman, who said, well, I'm going to write all about the cultures of the German tribes. And he called it Germania. The Romans called that region Germania, and Tacitus had these books called Germania. And he says, well, their main god is Hercules. Well, the Germans didn't call anybody Hercules. The Germans had different names, but the Romans could look at what the German tribes were talking about and saying, and they would say, well, tell us about this god. And they would listen for a while, and then they would say, aha, I think that's Hercules. Or wait, I think that's Mercury. The god you're describing is the god we call Hercules. Or Plutarch, I just mentioned this in a recent video. Plutarch talks about Egypt, and in his story of Isis and Osiris, he starts talking about the different gods and goddesses of Egypt, and he says, well, the Egyptians call Zeus Amun, and the Egyptians call Dionysus Osiris. So the ancients understood that the different gods and goddesses had different names, but similar characteristics around the world. And this is what we find in the myths. In the constellations, those constellations have characteristics, just like you know from astrology, Sagittarius. If I were to say to you or to many of your listeners, tell me about Sagittarius, you could probably talk for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, all about the characteristics that are associated with Sagittarius. So if there's a god or a goddess who is associated with that constellation, Sagittarius, we see those characteristics around the world. When I find a god that's based on Sagittarius or a goddess, they're going to have certain characteristics around the world. So I prepared a few visuals to show people what I mean when I say
yes,
based on the stars, because I've been talking now for a few minutes, but people might still be saying, what is
where
he
is the
talking about?
connection? Well, this is exactly what I wanted to ask you, David, because what you see indeed, exactly like you said, Mars would be Ares of the Greeks, um, Mars of the Romans, Nergal of the Babylonians, but they all share quite similar features, not the same. Here is the interesting thing, they are not the same, but they are quite similar.
Quite similar, that's right. And so the question is, where did it all come from? And it seems like,
Yes.
like you said, there's some differences, some slight evolution between, or India, the gods of the Vedas, the gods and goddesses, you can see connections as well, but there's already differences or slight.
You
It's
say
like
evolution.
it's
Evolution,
almost
remember
like,
this word. I would like to ask you more how you see the evolution. This is key word.
right, because to me, and we can talk about it more later, but I believe there was some kind of a catastrophe that happened. And then all around the world, people picked up the pieces. It's like a jigsaw puzzle, and different pieces are all around the world. In some parts of the world, maybe they got these pieces more than other parts got these pieces. But it's hard to know because it was so long. This was before Egypt, before Sumer. If they're already using the same system, this must be even more ancient, I believe, than even India or Sumer, Mesopotamia, Babylon, Egypt, India, China.
Yes.
China's very ancient. But let me show,
Show us,
before we
please.
get too into the deep stuff, let me just show what I mean. I'll share my screen. Let me get back to slide number 1 here. Or slide number 1. Yes. Okay. So I'll start with let me share my screen first, but I'll start with a Bible story because that's familiar to a lot of people.
Exactly.
And
Yes.
it will also, I think, show it pretty quickly and pretty conclusively. So I decided to
Yes,
start with
please.
this. Here we have Adam and Eve. In this passage, we could choose lots and lots of things. Fix the power cord. Okay, sorry. We could start with lots and lots of different stories. I just chose this one is very visual and quick, but it also relates to some of the things we'll be talking about in Babylon or Mesopotamia too. Genesis, the story of Genesis 3. This is Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and the serpent says, hey, did God really say you can't eat from the trees of the garden? And Eve says, no, he said we can. There's just one tree we can't, because if we touch that one, we'll die. And the serpent says, well, you won't really die. Okay, so we're all familiar with that story. They take the fruit. Eve eats of the fruit, finds out that it's good, gives it to Adam. He eats the fruit, and then God says, where are you? They're hiding from God. Now they're ashamed. There's all kinds of things that go on in this story, but they all get thrown out of Eden. First, God talks to the serpent and says, because you did this, you're going to crawl in the dust and eat dust all your life. And then he talks to the woman and says, you're going to get kicked out and you're going to have pain in childbirth. And then he says to the man, you're going to get kicked out and you're going to have to sweat by the sweat of your brow, and you're going to die. From dust you came, and to dust you return. We all are probably familiar with that story. It is a celestial story. It is celestial. When God says, from dust you came, and to dust you shall return, that's because Adam is a constellation. Constellations come up off the eastern horizon, and they go through the sky, and then they go back down, and they sink back into the dust again, the western horizon. And we can see that this is celestial with this very famous verse, Genesis 3:15. As part of the curse, he gives a curse to each one. We already just mentioned them: pain in childbirth, eating by hard work and the sweat of your brow instead of just getting, the paradise. And to the serpent, he says, you're going to have to crawl on your belly. You're going to be cursed above all the other animals, and you shall eat dust all the days of thy life. And then in Genesis 3:15, he continues for the serpent. He says, serpent, I will put enmity. I'll have an enemy relationship between you and the woman. It's going to be enemy time between you and the woman, and between thy seed, your offspring, and her seed. It shall bruise her seed, her offspring will bruise your head, and you will bruise his heel. Thou shalt bruise his heel. So this is a very well-known passage. In fact, when I used to go to church, I would hear preachers would call this the proto-gospel. They would say, oh, this is all about Jesus coming to bruise the serpent, crush the serpent's head. But first the serpent will have to bruise, Jesus will have to suffer. It's all in this verse. Well, maybe it is all in that verse because the Jesus story is also based on the stars. But let me show you what I believe is very clearly going on in this this one particular passage shows us a relationship that's found in myths of other cultures too, where there's a constellation standing on top of another constellation. I'm going to outline them. Very important constellations. So I put the verse up there, and just below the verse, can you see the screen okay, Krasi?
Yes, yes, it's very, very visible. Yes.
Great. So I've put the stars of part of the heavens up, the part that I want to talk about here. This constellation that I'm about to outline on the left of everyone's screen as we're looking at it, you can see the Milky Way band going through along the left part of the screen. And there's a constellation standing beside the Milky Way. I'm going to outline
I see.
a little bit brighter. That's
Ophiuchus.
Yeah, it's from a Greek word. It can be pronounced a couple different ways. Some people say Ophiuchus, and you're from Bulgaria, which is closer to Greece than I am. So you probably know that the term oph, that part of the word means serpent. Ophiuchus means the serpent holder. Yeah. So Ophiuchus is a serpent holder. If you look at the constellation itself, it is a central body that looks almost like an obelisk or a tombstone. Like there's a rectangle and a triangle on top. That's the central body, the part that looks like an obelisk, or it's a rectangle and a triangle on top. On either side, there's a serpent halves. The left side is usually called the tail. As we're looking at it, there's a left side that's pointing towards the Milky Way. And then the other side that has a little triangle, that's the head of the serpent. And then the feet down below. So that's Ophiuchus. And directly below Ophiuchus, I'm going to draw it in. The Ophiuchus, many people who know astrology know that Ophiuchus actually 1 foot goes through the zodiac, the ecliptic. So the ecliptic path actually goes right below Ophiuchus, we have the zodiac path. On the very, very left is the bow of Sagittarius just coming in, but directly below Ophiuchus, I'm going to outline it. This is Scorpio. That's Scorpio right below Ophiuchus. To the left of the stinger of Scorpio is the bow of Sagittarius, but Sagittarius is kind of cut off there. But right there, between Scorpio and Sagittarius is where Ophiuchus dips 1 foot down into the ecliptic. So the ecliptic goes through Sagittarius and Scorpio. The sun goes through Scorpio before it gets to Sagittarius, of course, but while it's going in between Scorpio and Sagittarius, it actually crosses that lower foot of Ophiuchus. And then to the right of Scorpio is Libra, and then Virgo. I'll sketch in Virgo a little bit later. You might be able to see Leo to the right of Virgo. It looks like a lion on your screen. But I'm focusing in for this verse just on Ophiuchus and Scorpio. Just on Ophiuchus and Scorpio. I've chosen to draw Scorpio with multiple heads because in many myths, Scorpio doesn't play a scorpion. Scorpio actually plays a serpent, sometimes with multiple heads, like the serpent that Hercules fights with multiple heads is the Hydra with 9 heads. But there's other places in the Bible where there's a dragon with 10 heads, or there are different serpents that have 7 heads in different myths. A lot of times in the myths of India, which I'll show, there's serpents with multiple heads. But look at Ophiuchus, look at Scorpio, and then look back up at that verse. I will put enmity between thee and the woman, between thy seed and her seed. It, meaning he's talking to the serpent here. It shall bruise thy head, serpent. Her offspring shall bruise thy head. But in turn, thou shalt bruise his heel. Can you see how Scorpio is really close to the heel?
Yes, very,
right there. Ophiuchus is basically standing as if he's standing on the head of Scorpio, but at the same time, Scorpio could sting the heel. Like the heel of Ophiuchus is very clearly right there. This is why I argue this verse is almost a clear giveaway. We would say it's a dead giveaway. It's a dead giveaway that this story is based on the stars. And I don't want to spend too much time on this Bible story because we're going to get to some Babylonian or Mesopotamian and some ancient Egypt a little bit. And I want to focus on that, but I have to kind of show everybody what I mean when I say the stories are based on the stars. I mean the characters in those stories and the action, the events themselves relate to the constellations. Now, if Ophiuchus is who's being talked about in this verse that's going to bruise the head of the seed of the serpent, who is he's the seed of the woman. Who's the woman that Ophiuchus could be the offspring? If seed means offspring here, who could Ophiuchus be the offspring of? Well, let me outline one more constellation here. That is the outline of Virgo. That's Virgo right there. In between Virgo and Scorpio is Libra. I didn't outline Libra, but that's the one that looks like a little triangle with two. Right in front of Scorpio is Libra. So we all know from astrology, it goes Virgo, Libra, Scorpio. Well, there's Virgo. Now look at the way this outline in the heavens looks.
Yes.
Remember the curse. God was giving a curse to each one of them. He said, well, for the woman, you're going to have pain in childbirth. The reason why I believe that was in that verse is because look at Virgo. She looks like she's in childbirth.
Indeed.
She's on her back,
But David, on the other hand, she's always the virgin, right?
Yes, that's right. So she's always a virgin. Even her name in, the constellation means a virgin. So that's why we have so many myths where there's a virgin who gives birth to somebody.
Yes.
But the different constellations can play lots of different characters, but it's pretty clear that the outline of Virgo could be interpreted as a woman giving birth.
Yes.
She's on her back with her legs up in the air and apart. Now, obviously, she could also be a woman having sex. I mean, that's a way that a woman could look having sex. And the myths have that going on too with Virgo. So she's not only a virgin. Sometimes there are stories where, even in the Bible, right, where Abraham and Sarah, they're talking about, hey, what's going on? Abraham and Sarah, I believe that is based on Virgo as well, because she looks like she could be having sex, or she looks like she could be having a baby. And if she's having a baby, if this verse is saying, hey, the seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent, the seed of the woman, I would argue, is Ophiuchus.
Offspring.
That is the offspring. The offspring that crushes the head of the scorpion, or in this case, the serpent. Actually, the serpent, it says it will crush the seed of the serpent, or it will between thy seed and her seed. So there's another serpent down below Virgo. That constellation is actually called Hydra. That could be, the seed of the serpent could be the Scorpio. But what I'm just showing is, in looking at these myths, once you start to realize that they're based on the stars, you can start to try and use the actual myths to understand which constellations they're talking about. And I'll show, but do you want to talk about that at all, or ask any questions
go
about
ahead.
that?
This is very interesting. Very.
Okay. So I'm just trying to prove with one example. There's, literally thousands of examples we could look to, but this is one example that shows how a Bible story is based on the stars. And this particular pattern of a figure associated with Ophiuchus standing on the head of a figure associated with Scorpio is also found in myths from other parts of the world. This is a myth, or a tradition that's recorded in ancient India, in the texts, the Sanskrit texts of India, about Krishna and the Kalia Nag. There's this multiple-headed Naga. In India, they have Nagas, which are like divine serpents. And sometimes they look like a cobra, and sometimes they look like a cobra with multiple heads. And there's one story about Krishna where he hasn't revealed that he's a god yet, and he's playing beside this river called the River Yamuna. I put the name of the river down below the serpent river, Yamuna. And they still reenact this every year in some parts of India. They actually have a big float that looks like the Kaliya Nag. Well, there's this big serpent, this powerful Naga named the Kaliya Nag, who has made his home in the river Yamuna. And he's so poisonous, all the fish in the river die. And you can see in this painting, the fish are kind of floating upside down because they've died. And even birds that fly over the river, because of the poisonous fumes that come off of the river, they die as they fly over the river. And all the villagers, they can't bring their cattle down to the river to drink water because it's poisonous. So Krishna, who's a god, says, I'm going to take care of this problem. And he takes on the form of a little boy, and he plays with a ball beside the river, and he makes sure that the ball falls into the river. And all the villagers say, hey, little boy, don't go in that river. But he climbs up a tree and dives into the river. And the villagers say, oh, that's the end of that little boy. He's never going to be seen again. But they don't realize that it's Krishna. And so the Kaliya Nag says, who is in my river? What's going on? He says, hey, little boy, don't you know you're about to die? And then Krishna starts dancing on the heads of the Kaliya Nag. And the Kaliya Nag says, wait a minute, something's going on here I didn't expect. And then Krishna starts to get larger and larger, and then take on more and more weight until he takes on the weight of the whole universe. And the Kaliya Nag is being crushed, and blood is coming out of his mouth. And Krishna is dancing on his head while playing the flute. Well, this is all based on the same constellations. It's just different characters. Can you see what I'm doing there? In fact, even I pointed out the Milky Way. Let me, I'll show you. I'll show you what I think is going on here. There's the Milky Way. That's the river Yamuna. You can see Scorpio is actually partly in the Milky Way and kind of out of it. And then Ophiuchus is dancing on its heads. That's Krishna. And in the painting, it doesn't really show it, but Krishna often is shown playing a flute. You can just go on the internet and look up Krishna and flute, and you'll see that Krishna statues, he's often playing a flute. And in this painting, he's kind of holding his hands like he's playing a flute, but they didn't really put the flute. But you can see. So that's how you spell Kaliya Nag. A lot of times they leave off the last letter, like instead of saying Naga, they say Nag. But he's a multi-headed serpent, just like Scorpio in the sky. And the flute, I'll just draw in where the flute would be. That's Krishna, the god Krishna, dancing on his head. The flute, is right there. That's what I think is the flute. Where would the flute be on Ophiuchus? Can you see on this?
Oh, yes, you can see that.
Yeah, on the other side from sometimes Krishna holds it. Yeah, the left side is a flute. You see that?
Yes.
So there's another, here's another.
Oh, this is amazing indeed. Impressive. Yeah.
See, there's Krishna. There's a better, this time Krishna, you can really see the flute there.
And also the way they position him.
Just like Ophiuchus. So that's what I mean when I say the world's myths are based on the stars. And then we can now go to Egypt or Mesopotamia. It's in the Bible. It's in the stories of ancient India. It's in the stories of Africa. It's in the stories of all around the world, the Pacific Islands, the Americas, the stories from the nations of North America and South America, the indigenous nations of the Americas, the Inca, the Maya. Well, we don't have a lot of what the Maya, there's one text that remains that talks about some of the myths, and there's a few codexes, but a lot of them were burned by the Catholic Church when they got over to the Americas. But it's around the world. That's what I've been spending the past 15 plus years looking at the myths and relating them to the stars. And so you asked, can we look at Egypt and make some connections to Mesopotamia? And so I'll try and do a little bit of that here, but I want to say that actually Egypt is also difficult. Egypt is a beautiful culture that left us so much artwork and so many inscriptions. And in this book that I published in 2019, this one is called The Ancient Worldwide System. I have several chapters in there. I try and go around the world to cultures around the world: Japan, China, the Maya, the Pacific Islands. But I have some chapters on Egypt, and I have some chapters on Mesopotamia, several chapters on India as well. But in this book, I talk about Egypt when they found the Rosetta Stone in the, I think it was 1799. The Rosetta Stone was found by the French in the town that has a modern day name of Rosetta. And the reason it was so important, it has inscriptions on the top, in the middle, and the bottom. Same inscription, 3 different writing systems. The top was the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. The middle was an ancient Egyptian system called Demotic. And then the bottom was Greek. Well, nobody knew how to decipher the hieroglyphs, but they did know Greek. So they started working on it as hard as they could to try and figure it out. And I believe it was not until 1819. I talk about the exact dates in the book. So
Yeah.
check that out. But around 1819, they finally, Champollion was this genius young French kind of code breaker. I think he started at the age of 30, maybe, or maybe it was 20. I forget. He was fairly young, but he deciphered. He was the first one to really have the insight that the Egyptian symbols could represent both words. Sometimes they could be a whole word, like a Chinese character, but sometimes they could be a letter or a sound, like a alphabetical letter. So they could function both ways. And that was part of the key that was so important for him to be able to decipher them. But once they deciphered them, they thought, oh, great, we'll finally get to know, what do the ancient Egyptians believe? What are all these gods and goddesses that they have written all over the place here? We'll be able to read their stories and figure it all out. Let me move our little faces out of the way. I can see it. I might have to just escape out of here so I can make us smaller and then go back to this. Okay, so this is a quotation from a professor at Oxford, Geraldine Harris Pinch, who is an Egyptology and Oriental languages expert, or chair of Oriental studies at Oxford, I believe was the title. I'm not sure exactly her title, but she's a well-regarded professor. And here's what she said. It soon became clear, they were so excited, that ancient Egyptian religion had not been centered on a single holy book comparable with the Bible or the Quran. They thought they were going to find some text that would make everything clear, but they were really disappointed. There were plenty of hymns and formulaic prayers, but few texts that Europeans would classify as theology or philosophy. The vast majority of temple inscriptions proved to be about kings making standard offerings to the gods, no collection of national myths, and few long narratives of any kind were recovered. So they were actually quite frustrated.
Yeah.
Such mythical narratives as did survive were mainly embedded in collections of funerary texts aimed at easing the transition into the afterlife, or in magical spells for use in daily life. So there were mentions of Osiris in the pyramid texts, but not a lot of explanation. The pyramid texts are on the insides of some of the 4th dynasty pyramids, and they later became similar to what was put on papyrus and called the Book of the Dead, that would be buried with certain mummies But they would mention Osiris or they would mention Isis, but they wouldn't tell you all their stories, because apparently the people who wrote those, the priests who knew how to write, they knew all the stories. They didn't write them down. There was I think there was I forget who made this quotation. I should have looked it up, but he said, the Greeks get credit for so much, but really the Greeks learned a lot from the Egyptians, but the Egyptians kept it all secret. The Greeks just blabbed it all out and told anybody about it. So the Greeks would tell the secrets of the Egyptians, and then the Greeks would get the credit for discovering it. Really, the Egyptians knew about Judaism.
I believe this is so. Yes.
Yeah, and but it was the Greeks the Egyptians kept things secret. Even Herodotus, when he went over to Egypt, he talked to the Egyptian priests, but he even said, they didn't really tell me all their all the things about their gods, so we still have to guess. Well, unfortunately, being able to read Egyptian didn't tell us. It's not like we got a copy of the Vedas like we have from India, or the Odyssey or the Iliad, or the poems of Hesiod like we have from Greece. We just don't have that about Egypt. We have some mentions that are embedded in the funerary text, like the Book of the Dead or the Pyramid text, or in magical spells for use in daily life. A relatively small number of mythical themes occurred over and over again in such sources. So they'll talk about Osiris over and over again. There's a few texts that talk about the battles between Horus and Set, and I talk about those in this book. But what I wanted to just say right up front is a lot of the Egyptian knowledge is still a mystery. It's still a mystery.
Yes.
But we can make some analysis, and I'll share a little bit with you, but it's difficult. And it's I think also it's a lot like in India, where the different gods and goddesses have, or especially the god Vishnu, has avatars. Vishnu is a god who also has an avatar. Krishna is actually one of the avatars of Vishnu. And these different gods and goddesses will show up in different forms, but it's actually the same god in a different avatar, is what it would be called in India. And actually in Egypt, we have something. The reason I say that is in Egypt, they have what are called 3 different theologies. Theology might not be the best word, but that's what the kind of Egyptologists over the past couple hundred years have called these. There were different capitals of Egypt down through the different millennia. Egypt is this, of course, very old civilization. And the first capital of Egypt was Memphis. And that's the middle one in my list here. But at the top, from north to south, the 3 different places where the priests were talking about the different gods and goddesses, Heliopolis, which in Egyptian was called On or Ayun. Some people think that Heliopolis, that's the Greek word for it. It means city of the sun, like Helios. Helios is the sun. Polis is a city, city of the sun. The Egyptians called it something that sounds like On or Iyun. Some people think that that is where we get our word in English, onion. An onion sounds like the city of the sun, Heliopolis. An onion is like a symbol of the sun. It has all these layers, but it's like a god with many layers, an onion. Anyway, that's a little bit of a tangent. But Heliopolis, the Egyptian name was on this map, it says, if you look real close, Iyunu. Nobody knows exactly. Here's the other thing. Nobody knows how the Egyptians pronounce the words. So if I say the name of a god or a goddess, nobody knows. I might say it and someone else might say, oh, it's pronounced a different way. Well, we don't know because they left out vowels. They didn't put in the vowels. So scholars, it's almost like a shorthand. The priests knew, just like in English, you would know if I put ST that's an abbreviation. Usually that means street. If I'm writing an address and I say 14 Elm ST, most people who read that would say, oh, he means street. But how would you figure out the word street just from the letters ST in 5,000 years? If someone finds a newspaper and it says 14 Elm ST, they wouldn't know that, oh yeah, back 5,000 years ago, that would be pronounced street, because all they put is ST. Yeah. But someone today reading that would know, because it's kind of a convention. But ST also can be short for saint. So if I put ST and then a space and then I put Augustine or Monica, then someone reading it they wouldn't think street Monica. They would see, oh, that obviously means Saint Monica, but we don't write it all the way out. We just put ST. Mm-hmm. That's easy for us because we all speak English and we use these abbreviations.
Yeah.
The Egyptians, the Egyptian priests didn't put in the vowels, but they knew how to pronounce it, but we don't. So we're kind of in the boat of someone who sees ST and we don't know, is that pronounced street? Is that pronounced saint? Is that pronounced set? What is that? Sat? Two? So we don't actually know exactly how they pronounced a lot of these things. But anyway, I'm getting off track. I like to I like to go off on tangents, but sometimes it's not good for listeners. You might be getting frustrated. So here's the three. Okay. Yeah, the reason I bring these up is because in the Egyptian mythology, there seems to be a whole set of myths centered around Memphis. And Egyptologists call that the Memphite theology. And they've got a whole set of gods and goddesses from Memphis. But then later, they moved the capital to Thebes, which is way further south, as you can see from the arrow. That's actually further south is Upper Egypt, because the Nile flows from south to north. So the higher ground is actually to the south, and they call that Upper Egypt. It says on the map there. So Thebes was the capital of Upper Egypt, and for a short time, the priests were at Thebes, or for, not a short time. Egypt was this long civilization, but there's a whole Theban theology group, a different group of gods and goddesses, and a whole different creation story from the gods and goddesses of Thebes, gods and goddesses from Memphis, and the gods and goddesses from Heliopolis. Later it moved to Heliopolis. And then we've got a whole Heliopolitan theology. And the main god in each of those three different theologies is different. But actually, I would argue it's the same god. It's the same gods and goddesses, just different avatars or some slight differences. And maybe you want to talk about this. Like those evil.
Like in Babylon, it was the same, like you say.
Right. So in Heliopolitan theology, the main god is Atum or Atum. And like I said, if someone wants to criticize my pronunciation, I would argue, well, none of us know for sure. So I'll just say Atum. Yes. But it sounds like Adam. Some people say, aha, that's where maybe we get our word Adam.
Adam. Yeah.
Adam. Yeah. In Greek, Adam means unable to be divided. But maybe some people have said, well, this god should actually be pronounced Tum. And maybe he's the undivided. Atum, Tum, Tumi. Anyway, that's the god of Heliopolis. In Memphis, the main god was Ptah. And some people think that might be where we get the word Buddha. Ptah might later evolve into the name of Buddha or other different evolutions of the name. But in the Memphis theology, there's a whole creation story of Ptah. And then in Thebes, their theology centers around Amun or Ammon. That's where we have Tutankhamun or, Amun. I'm not saying her name right. Forgetting it. It's mind blank. But the point is, these are three different sets of stories. In that book that I showed, the Ancient Worldwide System, I go into each one of these, but I argue that they're all actually using the same constellation for this main god. And so I'm going to show you a picture actually of Amun Min. There's a fertility god named Min, and Amun Min. Amun, this god Amun from Thebes, he usually has this very tall headdress. If you look at this carving here, there's a very tall double feather headdress on the head of this god Amun or Amun Min. I'm going to point out some characteristics of this god. And like I said, Min is this fertility god. You can see there's a distinctive fertility characteristic. But starting with that headdress, it's a high square headdress. I believe those are ostrich feathers. Sometimes the Egyptian gods will have an ostrich feather headdress. Even when they're wearing the crown, Osiris sometimes wears the white crown, but it'll have the ostrich feathers on either side sometimes. But I just want to point out those feathers, the high squarish kind of head or rectangular head. You know, when you look at it all together, it's kind of a square head. Then he's got an upraised arm. See his arm like upraised, like it's almost like he's about to slap somebody. He's about to hit you with his upraised arm, I would argue. And then of course he's also got a very sexual part of his body there. We'll talk about what that is in the constellation, but I just want to point out his headdress and his upraised arm at first, because I'm going to argue that this image can help us figure out which constellation this god belongs to. And it's above Ophiuchus, and I'm going to outline this constellation just above Ophiuchus. Your viewers may be able to see Ophiuchus that we outlined earlier. I'll come back to Ophiuchus a little bit later, but this constellation above Ophiuchus, we call that the constellation of Hercules. Yes.
Amazing, yeah.
Such an important constellation. Yeah. Can you see how the actual constellation in the sky has a square head?
Absolutely, yes.
Square-shaped head. So a lot of important gods in different myths around the world are associated with Hercules, and I would argue that Amun, Ta, and Atum are all in the Egyptian theologies are all associated with this constellation Hercules, and I'll show you why. So I already pointed out there's this square-shaped head. Gods who have this kind of high square headdress or feathers their head, it might be because they are connected to Hercules. We need more clues, but that's one clue.
Yes.
Can you see how the head is kind of square? Now, I'll show in a little while how Zeus, the god Zeus or Jove or Jupiter, is also associated with this constellation. Just because it's called Hercules, that's also the constellation that plays Zeus. Zeus is the father of Hercules, or Jupiter is the father of Hercules or Heracles. Does Zeus have a square-shaped head? Yes. He has a big full beard, right? He has a big full beard. Zeus always has a big full beard. Hercules figures often will have a full beard. Or Hercules himself, the hero, Hercules or Heracles. Does he have a square full beard? Yes. And he makes his head even more square by putting a lion head on top, right?
Yes.
So we can see that, but also we see this outstretched arm kind of, or upraised arm or a weapon overhead. In this case, it looks like a sword in the heavens, but it could be a club, or it could be just this upraised hand, or in this case, on this image, we've got kind of a flail or, a weapon. But these two features show some evidence. I'll have to give you more evidence, but I'm going to argue that Amun and Ta and Atum, I don't have time to go into all of them, but I do go into them in that book.
Yeah.
They're all based on Hercules. And I'll show you why. I'll also show you why he has that erection. In all these stories of Egypt, they're kind of off-putting or a little bizarre. Like Atum creates the universe. He creates the world by his semen. So he actually masturbates the world into existence in Egyptian texts. That's it's weird, it's bizarre. It's like, well, no wonder we don't teach Egyptian myths to kids. We only teach Greek myths. But it's based on the stars. I'll show you in a little bit, but I also want to show let's see here. I clicked, what do I have?
So do we have the creation myth of the Egyptians then? Because
Yes.
This text exists, such text exists, you're saying?
Yeah, oh, they definitely exist. It's in the pyramid text. It's in one of the utterances. The pyramid texts are called utterance 583 or utterance spell. Sometimes they were called spell 583. Okay, so I just showed it, but I didn't show it very well. So let me show it again.
Okay.
Let me I was not looking where I was talking. All right, here's Hercules. Here's the square-shaped head. Here's the upraised arm. Now why he has this bigger, you can see from the drawing. I didn't point an arrow to it, but everyone could see there's a, he's got an erection in the drawing, right? So the male organ is very prominent in the carving, right?
Okay, yes.
You see that in the Egyptian carving on the right. Now look over at the Hercules outline. The outline of Hercules, if I take away, Hercules has this deep lunging posture.
Okay.
See the posture? But in the Egyptian drawing, is not in that posture. Usually in artwork, it is in that posture, but in this outline, it's just standing there, but with a, erection, and the male sexual, member is very prominent. Now look over at Hercules. I'm going to take away one line, just one line. I'll just remove one line from the outline.
Okay.
Let me see what happens here. Can you see how you could have a...
Yes. Yeah, I understand what you mean. Yes.
And he could just have one leg, just like in the drawing. Or you could also draw a line, from his waist down to the where we used to have the line for the foot. You could just draw a line straight to that.
Yeah.
And he would still have a big erection, right? And I argue in my book, that's why the Egyptian stories have this kind of strange creation where the god, spills his semen onto a primordial mound or a primordial pyramid. Well, right underneath Hercules, can you see a pyramid shape on the top of Ophiuchus?
Yes.
Triangle? That's in the myths. So what I'm trying to show everybody is that the Egyptian prime god, the creator god, is associated with this constellation Hercules. And we can see that from the headdress, the square-shaped head, from the upraised arm, and also from, you could imagine that, the sexual aspects of it. There's a lot of myths that are fairly sexually explicit. There's even in the Bible, there's a lot of stories that are fairly sexually explicit, and that's based on the stars. Now, I'm going to show a couple images from around the world. This is an image from New Zealand. This is a carving from New Zealand of a tiki. Tiki is a god, or tikis are god figures, and they almost always have a square-shaped head. Sometimes they have feathered headdresses that make their head square on top. If you look at
the hand,
yeah, and the hand he's got a club over his, yeah. Now he also has his tongue sticking out. His tongue sticking way out. This is common in figures associated with Hercules. Can you see how, if you look at the square-shaped head of Hercules, can you see how the arm could be like
tongue,
a tongue, a really long tongue sticking out? Can you see what I mean?
Yes.
Arm, it's coming right out of the head. It's like a tongue. In the Egyptian myths, I know this gets bizarre, but in the Egyptian writings about how Atum created the world and everything in it, he took his semen into his own mouth and then spit out these different gods and goddesses, like Nut of the sky or Shu of the air. And it's weird. It's like, what am I reading? Why am I reading this? Well, why is he spitting out of his mouth? It's because Hercules either has his tongue sticking out or could be spitting out of his mouth. Like that arm could be envisioned. They're very creative, these myths, how they use the constellations. And the Egyptian myths they're bizarre. The Egyptian myths are a little more bizarre and more they feel a little more alien to us, I think, than the Greek myths. But in the Greek myths, Athena pops out of the head of Hercules. So we have these aspects of the myths that seem a little strange to us. It's because they're based on the stars. But look, around the world, we have gods who are associated with Hercules in the same kind of posture, with the upraised arm, the square-shaped head, in this case, tongue sticking out. And there's a god from Egypt, a different god, who looks a lot like this tiki. This is a god called Bes, B-E-S. He's a lion-headed god. It doesn't look very lion-headed in this little statue, but if you look up Bes on the internet, or if your listeners just do an internet search for Egyptian god Bes, B-E-S, he has a lion head. Well, lions have a beard or a mane. Hercules himself has a lion over his head. He puts a lion headdress on. Bes is also associated with Hercules. We can see that. See how he's got his club sticking up? And Bes also, a lot of statues of Bes have a tongue sticking out.
Yes, and the hand again.
In the hand, just like the Egyptian god. But look at his headdress. What does Bes have on his head?
Absolutely.
Feathers. It's the same as Tiki. It's the same as this god Min or Amun Min from Egypt. So I think hopefully I've established for listeners,
yes,
Egypt is hard. Egypt is difficult. Figuring out which gods and goddesses connect to which constellations. In Egypt, we don't have a lot of help because we don't have big, long texts like the Vedas or like the texts of other
Did they
cultures.
burn out everything in the Alexandria library?
Alexandria
Maybe
Library, yes.
on purpose they destroyed all these texts there.
Maybe so. That's a very good point, Krasi. Yes, for sure. But now I want to make a bridge to some Babylonian for you, because you said, well, help me understand, some connections to my expertise as Babylon. And I'm so interested in, so I want to try and do that for you. This is an actual image from Mesopotamia, and that is Marduk.
Marduk, yes.
And look at his headgear. Can you see his headgear?
Oh, yes, very interesting.
Is it square? You see how it's square there? Can you see the headdress?
Yes.
Now, that's just his headgear. People might say, well, I'm not so sure Marduk is really associated with Hercules just from that. Can you give me something more? I said, well, yes, let's see what else we can find. I spend a lot of time actually in my book that I showed, Ancient Worldwide System. But here's another one. This is...
No?
Yeah, I think nobody is sure who it is, actually. But look at the outline. Whatever this ancient... I think it's from Nineveh or from the library or from Ashurbanipal. I'm not positive, but the posture is very much like Hercules. You see how one leg is very far back, and he's holding over his head like a thunderbolt. And he has a big square beard. And so if that's not Marduk, it's definitely based on the artist is using Hercules for an outline, because
like ideal image.
Yes.
Also
and
for
this
that time.
And this one from ancient Greece is very similar to it. See the deep lunge of Zeus? That's Zeus from a piece of pottery that still exists to this day. It's in a museum in Germany now, but it's Zeus fighting a monster named Typhon, and Zeus is in this deep lunging posture, holding a thunderbolt over his head, just like that Mesopotamian image. There's a lot of evidence that Marduk and Enlil are connected to Hercules. Zeus is definitely connected to Hercules. I can say that with a lot of confidence. Zeus is based on Hercules. Zeus, of course, is associated with the planet Jupiter. Marduk, correct me if I'm wrong, but is Marduk associated with Jupiter?
Jupiter, yes.
Yeah. And so I don't know if the Egyptians connected their gods to the planets. We can talk about this a bit more. But if they did, I would be inclined to believe that the god Amun and Atum and Ta would be associated to Jupiter.
Mm-hmm.
But so mostly my focus is on the constellations and the stars, but definitely for astrology and for understanding the influences of the moon and the planets, we have to see where the planets are in the background of the stars. But I wanted to also show this part about Zeus fighting Typhon. I'm going to put it down here below Hercules and Ophiuchus. You see how Typhon has two legs that turn into serpents?
Exactly, yes.
His body has a human torso, but then down below the waist turns into two serpents. So this goes back to Ophiuchus. So if you look at the constellation Hercules there, just below Hercules, I'll outline Ophiuchus again, which we saw before when we were talking about Adam and Eve and the seed that would be on.
And Marduk
Yeah.
fighting Tiamat.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Connection
And
again,
Zeus
yeah.
fighting, Zeus fighting
Very interesting.
Typhon. And Typhon has legs that are serpents. See the legs that are serpents.
Yes,
So
indeed.
Ophiuchus,
Mm-hmm.
Ophiuchus has these two serpent halves. And if we just the serpent halves are actually a little bit brighter than the feet. If we just imagine the human feet going away, I just take them out there, then you can see why it's a central body with two serpent feet coming out.
Yes.
You see what I'm
Yes,
arguing?
yes, yes. Mm-hmm.
Ophiuchus has a central body, and if instead of imagining the feet being human feet, you could say, oh, well, there's two serpent feet coming out.
Exactly.
So human torso with serpent legs or a serpent, lower body. I spend a lot of time arguing. I'm just kind of going over it fast right now, but that is an indicator of Ophiuchus. And here it is again, Ophiuchus and Hercules. I wanted to show some Babylonian cylinder seals or also Assyrian cylinder seals, where this is Enki actually talking to the Babylonian Noah figure, Ziusudra in Sumerian, or his name is Utnapishtim, I think, in Babylonian languages or Akkadian languages. But see how he's depicted as having a human body and then a serpent down below?
Yeah, indeed.
And there's a couple different, that's Enki. People, scholars are pretty, I'm not saying anything controversial when I say that figure is Enki, but I'm arguing that's associated with Ophiuchus. You won't find, as far as I know, any scholars who have connected Enki to Ophiuchus. But Enki is the one who comes down and helps humanity survive the flood that Enlil or Marduk unleashes this flood on humanity. Enki is the one who comes and tells Utnapishtim or Ziusudra, hey, you need to build an ark, or you need to build a box to escape this flood. So if Enki is associated with Ophiuchus, that's very interesting, because the god who comes down to live among humanity, or who comes down to help humanity, is associated with Ophiuchus. Remember, we were talking about the zodiac. Ophiuchus is actually comes down to the zodiac, but is usually left out of the zodiac. That's why Ophiuchus is such an important figure. It's like a god that is partly down on earth in the zodiac, but partly connected to the heavens. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, of course.
And that's why Enki is like the one who comes down and helps humanity to survive the flood, because Enlil wants to get rid of humanity. Enlil or Marduk says, oh, these humans, they're reproducing too many humans. They're making too much noise. We got to send a flood and wipe them out. And Enki says, okay, I will go and help.
Dave, what is your opinion? Excuse me for interrupting, but now is the time to
Yeah,
interrupt you.
yeah,
What
yeah,
is your
yeah.
opinion about this noise? I am always wondering about how come people were noisy and the gods decided to destroy them. There is some symbol there which I do not understand. This has other meaning, I believe. It's not about the noise, right? There is something else.
Yeah, that is a
What is your
great.
feeling? Because this doesn't make sense. People are noisy, let's destroy them, right?
It doesn't make sense. I don't think it's literal. You're right. I
I
don't
also,
think these
and I don't
stories are
understand the
literal.
meaning really.
Hmm. I don't know. I'm
Yes,
sorry.
one day we will find
It's a
out.
great
I also
question.
don't know.
Yeah, they will find out. But it's like the gods, they like humans to give them the uh, the honor and the worship and the sacrifices, but they don't want them to be too noisy. It's like kids. Kids are noisy. They they get. We don't want to you know we don't want to stifle them. We want them to grow, but it's like
What,
it's like the gods are like parents that are like
Dave, what if this was another
frustrated.
awakening wave like now? We don't obey. What
Yes,
if
it's
people
like
were
kids growing
awakening
up.
also back then?
Yes, yes, and it's like when humanity gets too close to the gods get frustrated or they get too mature. It's like
Yeah.
teenagers. Mm. The gods get frustrated because the teenagers are disturbing their sleep. I think that's what it is, Krasi, is it's
Maybe another
like
wave of awakening because this is something which is repetitive over time. You know, again, awakening wave, then then like
yeah.
upgrading the matrix type of thing.
Mm. I really like your latest videos about what's going on in the world and the cycles
Oh,
and the
thank
ages.
you. Yeah.
And I like this question very much because it's like, can you think of anything in the Bible that's similar? Of course, there's a flood in the Bible, but it doesn't say because the humans were making too much noise. There's
Yes.
another thing in the Bible where the humans get too close to the gods. You remember what that is?
Where it is? Well, no.
In the Bible, there's a part where God says, hmm, these humans are getting a little too close to us. We got to confuse them.
Ah, yes.
The tower, they're trying to build a tower. Nimrod decides to build a tower
Uh-huh.
and to reach all the way up to the heavens. And God says, these gods or the gods, if you read the text, it actually sounds like because is God talking to himself or is it gods talking to them, talking amongst themselves? Wait a minute, these humans are getting a little too high up. They're getting a little too close. We're going to have to
Uh-huh.
go down and scatter their languages. It's the Tower of Babel.
Let's vaccinate them. They became too awake.
Mm.
Well,
It's a very interesting question that you bring up, Krasi.
we have to
It's
think about this.
mhm. I think these stories are actually about what's going on inside us as well.
Hmm. Hmm.
We have these we have all these voices making noise inside us that
Hmm.
keep us from connection with the divine. We
Yes.
have a divine voice that actually knows what to do, that actually has compassion and connection to others. But we have all these other voices that are making too much noise inside of us too.
Hmm.
And sometimes afterwards, looking back, we say, "What? Who? Why did I do that? I acted like such a jerk. I acted like such an asshole. Why did I do that?" And I
Yes.
look, was that me? Well, it was one of the voices inside of me that took over
Mhm.
that kept me from acting the way I wish I would act. It's
Yes.
like prevented from becoming gods. We're
Hmm.
not quite divine. We've got all these other voices. I actually think the zodiac and astrology help us to understand all these different voices inside of us. Some of us have more Aries than others. Some of us have more Sagittarius. We all have a different chart, right? We have a different astrological makeup. It's like a different recipe. If I'm a, if I'm a set of ingredients, I'm one recipe. I might have a little bit more Aries sprinkled in, or a little bit more Mars, because I've got Mars in the first house, or I've got Mars retrograde, or I've got a Sagittarius rising sign. So I've got more Sagittarius than someone else who has a different recipe.
Indeed. Very well described.
Yeah, and it helps us to understand who we are and those voices inside of us that are making all this noise. Oh, I've got to recognize my Mars voice, or I've got to recognize my Venus. I've got to know, as I'm going through life, I've got to be able to understand those internal voices. But also, you asked about the planets. Why? Because the planets, what they're doing, I should also be aware as I walk through this life from one day to another where Mars is, or where the moon is, or where Venus is, because that's going to have an influence on me too. So I have to understand my recipe. That's my chart, and all my different ingredients. And I should also understand, Mars is doing this to the whole world right now. Mars is in retrograde doing this, or Mercury's in retrograde doing this. We have to know both of those. But maybe the myth is trying to show us that that's why we can't quite be, we're not godlike all the time, because these different voices create too much noise inside of us and keep us. We actually have a divine voice that's like Enki coming down and saying to, Ziusudra or Utnapishtim, something is about to happen. You need to build an ark. How did he know that? He wouldn't have known that without the gods telling him. We actually have a divine voice, and Ophiuchus figures are often the voice of the divine that comes down to tell us the right thing to do. That's Enki. And so let me show another thing about this seal. Look at how Enki is holding up in his hand something.
Yes, indeed.
In that hand that's kind of outstretched a little bit, I would say that's probably another connection to Ophiuchus. See that?
Oh, yes, what he holds. Yes, indeed. Very, very interesting. Yeah.
It is. It's so clear from these. And here's another one. This is also Enki. Scholars who write about this, these are cylinder seals from Mesopotamia that you can, roll them out in the clay, and they say, oh, yeah, this is Enki. And look, he's got his outstretched arm, but this time he doesn't seem like he has anything in his hand, but he still has a little V shape in his hand. See how his hand
serpent again.
Yeah, it's just like the V shape at the top of Ophiuchus. But look what's above kind of his elbow. So if you look above his elbow, there's this like star right there, or sunburst. And that, I argue in that same book that I showed you, see Hercules above Ophiuchus? There's another outline to Hercules. There's the outline that we've been looking at where Hercules is like got a square-shaped head, but we could also outline differently, with that square-shaped head being like in the middle of a whirling whirlwind or a sunburst. And Hercules' gods are often associated with whirlwinds or with storms, just like Zeus is a thunder god. Zeus is a thunder god. Well, Enlil, who sends the flood, or Marduk, is a thunder god, or is a storm god, right?
Yes.
And that's right above the V shape is this, this whirling disc, or that's right in the right position. I argue in my book that Enlil, or Marduk, is associated with Hercules, and Enki is associated with Ophiuchus. And some scholars even think Enlil means Lord, and Lil. Some scholars argue that Lil means wind, Lord Wind, the god of the wind, or the whirlwind. And some scholars say that Enki means Lord Mound, or Lord Mount, or like Lord Earth, like the mound of earth. Enki is Ophiuchus, see how Ophiuchus could be a mountain or a mound because of that triangular top?
Yes. Oh,
Just
yes.
like in the Egyptian, where the first earth that came up from the waters was a pyramid shape, the Benben in Egypt. That Enki, some scholars think that Enki means Lord Mound and Enlil means Lord Wind. So when you ask, well, which constellation, not, I mostly focus on the constellation, but you wanted to connect to some planets. So I think Enlil or Marduk would associate with Hercules. Hercules figures are associated with the planet Jupiter, like Zeus is associated with Jupiter, Marduk, Jupiter. So Enki, who would he be associated with? Let me show you an outline. Oh, there's one more constellation in this top cylinder seal. There's this kind of shallow moon-shaped crescent over to the right. I would argue that's probably this constellation here. That's the Northern Crown. I talk about that in some other videos, but that shows that we're in the right neighborhood of the sky.
Yes.
Let me show you who I think, which planet I think Ophiuchus might connect to. Who do you think that would be? If I were to show you that as a god, I said, this is a statue of a god. Who might that be? What god might be associated with that statue? It's from a museum, I think, in Germany also.
Oh,
Do you know which god that would
tell
be
me.
from the
No.
Greek and Roman? It's Saturn.
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 Uh-huh.
Saturn is associated with, he has a scythe or a sickle. See the big
I
sickle
see it. Ah,
there?
yes. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm.
And also Saturn's associated with time, Chronos.
True. Mm-hmm.
Chronos, and you see how the statue is holding up an hourglass up above his head? That
Yes.
hourglass there. So Saturn is associated with time, also with a sickle to
Uh-huh.
cut down the
Uh-huh.
grain. So that's a statue of Saturn. Can you see how that god with a sickle on that side and an hourglass on the other side, which of the constellations we've been looking at? You see how Ophiuchus could be Saturn
Could be. And they
because of
could
the
can have
sickle?
multiple rulership, like
Yeah,
one um 1 second, like one divinity can rule different either planet and constellations, not only one. So this makes sense.
yeah. That's what I'm more focused on the constellations, but if I had to guess, oh, well,
Mm.
who might Enki, what planet might he be associated with? Well, I've spent some time arguing here that Enki is associated with Ophiuchus. Even the name Enki means Lord Mound, at least according to some scholars. They argue about this. I could be wrong, but there's a lot of evidence from artwork like this, where there's a serpent down below the torso, that Enki is associated with Ophiuchus. Well, if Enki is associated with Ophiuchus,
Mhm.
I would argue that Saturn, the god Saturn, is also associated with Ophiuchus. He's associated with a sickle. He's associated with an hourglass. You see how there's a sickle on one side of Ophiuchus? If you look at that serpent tail, it's the
Mhm.
same shape as a sickle.
Indeed. Mhm.
I put the word sickle right over it. Look, it's even on the same side on the statue. The statue looks like Ophiuchus. On one side is a sickle, on the other side is an hourglass, or it's just a
Yes.
little triangle in the sky. An hourglass is a double triangle, but in the sky it's just a single triangle. But with a little bit of imagination, Ophiuchus is holding up on one side a sickle, on the other side an hourglass. So I would say Enki is probably associated with Saturn, probably the planet Saturn. I don't know for sure.
We will
That's all the
never be
slides
knowing.
I had.
We
I
can
didn't want
never
to
know
talk.
for sure.
No, we can't know for sure, but
No,
let me
we
stop
cannot know for
share.
sure.
I just,
Indeed.
I didn't want to, yeah, I didn't want to go too long on just, me talking. I wanted to have a conversation with you, Krasi. I know I've
No,
talked for
and
quite a
this was very,
time, but
very, very interesting. And in fact, this is again, to say that, for example, Enki can rule Ophiuchus, but he can also rule uh, other things. They are not really limited to only one rulership. This is very important, because some can argue, say yes, but Enki is ruling, has some rulership maybe over Aquarius because of the
Mm.
because in the cosmology, of the Babylonians, he's associated with the sweet water. So
Oh, yes.
there is some
Water
link
god.
with
Yeah.
Aquarius, but he can be linked also to many others. That's
Yeah.
why we will never know for sure. We need to research this, and maybe they destroyed the libraries, but the knowledge they will
Yes.
never be able to hide.
No, that's very interesting about the sweet water, right? Because Tiamat is salt water, right? And
Yes, and they yes,
and but also remember we pointed out that Ophiuchus is standing right next to the Milky Way.
yes,
Remember when we saw that? But it's very interesting that you said Aquarius because figures in myth, I've found this over and over. There is a connection. Ophiuchus figures often also have a connection to Aquarius. I even said this really briefly in this most recent, excuse me, I got a
no
little
problem.
tickle in my throat. I even said in that most recent video, I just sent it to you today, so you might not have had time to see it, but I
Mhm.
mentioned how Jesus is associated with Ophiuchus, the cross. He's born of a virgin. We showed how in the sky Ophiuchus could be born from Virgo, but also there's a cross in Ophiuchus. I talk about it in this video. People can
Yes.
check out on the YouTube
Mm-hmm.
channel.
Mm-hmm.
But I did say, as I was introducing that idea, I just said briefly, now Jesus is also associated with Aquarius because Jesus says the sign of the Son of Man. Well, which of the zodiac signs could be a son of man? They're mostly animals, but Aquarius is a person, a man, right? And also, Jesus pours out water that turns to wine. And also, Jesus says, I separate the sheep from the goats.
Mm-hmm.
Aquarius separates Aries from Capricorn. If you think about the zodiac, after Capricorn comes Aquarius, then comes Pisces, then comes Aries, right?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
So so on one side of Aquarius is Capricorn, which is a goat. On the other side of Aquarius is Pisces, which is fish. But Jesus doesn't say I separate the fish from the goats. So if we go one more, we get to Aries, which is a ram or a sheep. And so Aquarius does separate the sheep from the goats, right?
The Bible is astrology.
Yes. And so that shows that Jesus is also associated with Aquarius, but I can show that Jesus is associated with Ophiuchus, both. So
Yes.
you
With
just said,
multiple.
oh, it's
Yeah.
so interesting. Enki is associated with Aquarius, but he could also be associated with Ophiuchus. Well, Jesus too is
Yes.
associated with both Aquarius and Ophiuchus. And what does Jesus do? He comes down to be with to the mortal is like a god that comes down. Enki is a god who comes down to say to the humans, hey, a flood is coming. So Enki is a god who comes down figure. So is Saturn. Saturn actually comes and dwells among mankind to teach how to grow grain and things in the Saturn myth. So the connection that you just made is so interesting that Enki is also Aquarius.
It could
I
be,
didn't think
yes.
about that.
But I want to
Mm.
ask you this, David. We started with this, and maybe a little bit to conclude on in this direction. You mentioned in the beginning evolution of this, because we're comparing and we can compare forever,
Yes.
myths, and they will all make sense. They will all make sense, especially the way you very nicely presented them. It was so visible indeed. But we say evolution, and if we see the myths of Mesopotamia and we go to the more recent myths of Rome, the Romans, how do you feel? Is there, like, because it goes together with the evolution or devolution of the human race, do you see evolution in the features of these divinities? How do you see it? Because you see that slowly with the time, they represent a bit different. Um, let's say you take Kronos. Kronos was not ruling time in Mesopotamia. Kronos was ruling time later for the Greeks, right? So you see changes, maybe not very big, but you still see changes. Do you see them? This is devolution or evolution?
That's a good question. Very good question. Whenever I say that's a good question, that's my secret code for I don't know.
You have to think about it. No, I also don't
Yeah,
know. I'm thinking about this a lot because what above, so below. And actually, are we really in evolution as humans or
yeah.
not? This is actually where it leads.
It's such a good question to think about. And I think it's hard for anyone to know because
Yes,
this so long ago.
exactly.
I think the evidence is very strong that there was a catastrophe on
Mm,
Earth, that wherever this system came from, it was somewhere before ancient Egypt, because the earliest ancient Egyptian images and myths already have this system, but so
mm,
does the earliest Sumerian writings of Inanna.
mm,
Goes down to the underworld. She gets hung up on a hook.
mhm,
It's using this system. The Gilgamesh epic is very, very early. Even in Sumer, they had Bilgamesh instead of with a G, it was with a B, and it was very
mm,
ancient. It's already using this system. Well, if Egypt is so old, and the earliest Egyptian Narmer palette is already using it, and Sumer is so old, and the earliest Bilgamesh epic or Inanna epic or Inanna story is already using it. And if the Vedas are so old and they're already using it, did they all come up with it at the same time, independently, all separate? I don't think so. I think it came from somewhere before,
uh-huh,
and it did it change, or was there a
mm,
disaster? And then they picked up the pieces, and maybe some pieces, maybe Greece preserved a few extra
uh-huh,
pieces that India didn't get, but India preserved a few pieces that
uh,
Greece didn't get. Maybe that, instead of evolution, maybe instead of change, it's you know pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, like a puzzle that just got scattered by a catastrophe.
exactly.
And over here in America, the American Indians have some pieces that nobody
Mm,
else has.
exactly.
I don't know. I don't know.
No,
I think it's so long ago, nobody can maybe know, because the catastrophe was before Egypt. So who knows? So
no, no.
old. It's a good question. And some people would say, oh, well, the Bible is, more evolved or more higher because now we're not sacrificing to the gods anymore. Well, I'm not so sure.
Oh,
I'm
of
not
course
so
we are not.
sure.
They some do.
Yeah.
I
I
know
don't
some do
I don't
seriously.
believe that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's the same ancient stories, but somebody, wants to twist them. I talk about that in my videos and my books, but I think all these ancient stories, some of them got hijacked. the the people who want to make them literal have hijacked them, I argue. But anyway, it's such a good question you're asking. I'm giving you a long way of saying I don't know,
I
and I'm
also
not sure.
don't know, David. I also don't know. That's why I'm asking.
It's
But
a
this is
good,
very.
good question.
And I have last question to you, which I recently discovered something which is maybe not very known yet in America. This is Biblia Basica. It is believed that this is the Biblia of the Thracians, and it is more ancient than the Bibles we know. Much more ancient. The person who rediscovered this Bible was killed in Bulgaria. He's Bulgarian. The Bible is translated, I think, only in some Slavic languages, not in English. Anyway, my question is: this Bible, the Bible is mainly about Dionysus, God Dionysus,
Mhm.
and they claim Dionysus, Jesus. This is the Bible of Christ, but he has this other name, which is believed to be Thracian, very, very old, much before the Greeks came to stow the history. It is, Biblia basically speaks about Christ called Dionysus. Did you ever also meet some connections with Dionysus and Christ? This is because you really research. I mean, you read between the lines. That's why I'm asking you.
Yes, that's for sure.
That's for sure.
And
Yeah.
that's for sure. The Dionysus figure, he's a dying and resurrecting god. And he's also associated with both Ophiuchus and Aquarius. There
And
are vases. You can see Greek artwork where Dionysus is, or he's standing next to a goat. Well, that would be more like Aquarius, and he's pouring out,
mhm.
just like Aquarius, standing next to a goat, pouring out some wine. But there's also stories where Dionysus seems to be connected with Ophiuchus, just like Jesus.
Mhm.
And the the ancient, see, I believe these ancient myths, they're all connected, and
Very,
they're
very.
all and there are even ancient graffiti that show um, a um, a cross with a man being crucified, but he has a donkey head, like a donkey, and it says something like Dionysus becoming a god. Now, nobody knows exactly what that graffiti means, but there are ancient cults of Dionysus. The Dionysian cults, he comes from India in some of the myths, wearing leopard skin, and um, all these stories they're part of a universal system. So
Yes,
so you're talking about, I think, is it Thracian? Are you, how would you spell it? You're saying this
Thracian.
yeah,
I don't
yeah.
pronounce it well. I'm sure it's my mistake, but you
No,
understood
no,
what
no.
you.
In American English, we would say Thracian, but yes, the Thracian culture is very ancient, and
Yes.
it's connected to it, nobody knows exactly where all the different gods and goddesses that came to Greece. They argue about, oh, this Dionysus, maybe he's a later addition, or
No,
those are
no.
just those are just theories. No, I think the Dionysus story and the Jesus story, they're all telling us about, we have connection to an internal divine,
Yes. Yes.
but it gets torn up or killed or buried. That part of us, if you want to call it Jesus, you can call it Jesus. If you want to call it Dionysus, you can call it Dionysus. If you want to call it the Buddha, those myths are to show you about your own
You.
divine
Yeah.
spark that's been buried, that's been torn to shreds, like Orpheus, the Orphic cults. Orpheus gets torn to pieces. Jesus gets crucified. Osiris, Egyptian god. There's a passage from Plutarch where he says, well, from these aspects of Osiris, we can see that that's Dionysus, or we identify him with Dionysus. So Plutarch, an ancient writer, identified Osiris and Dionysus. He's saying it's the same God. So I would say that Jesus is the same, quote unquote, the same God. And
Yeah.
it's telling us about our own buried divinity that we need to bring back up.
Very.
The different voices, all those different, the different parts of us, the different parts of our zodiac have buried the Ophiuchus part. That's why Ophiuchus is not part of the zodiac. Ophiuchus is the hidden, buried, divine part of the zodiac in the ancient myths, I believe. And so figures associated with Ophiuchus are often the connection between the human and the divine, like Jesus, or like Enki, or like Dionysus.
Yes.
And they get killed to show that we have buried that divine part, but they come back to life to show that that part of us cannot be killed. It cannot be no matter what has happened to you, that divine part, that divine higher Dionysus is still there, no matter what trauma.
No.
And so that's what the myths, I believe, are showing us. So yes, I think Dionysus and Jesus are the
Also
same
are
myth.
associated. Well,
Yes.
thank you. This was
Mm.
amazing, amazing, David. I learned so much, really, and I loved this connection which you made with the different cultures. I think this is amazing, very helpful for our way to, to the truth, to awaken, really, because this is why we're here, to find who we really are. So I love also your the way you summarized. This is all about finding who we really are.
Well, thank you so much, Krasi, and thank you for
Thank you. Hope
having me
we
on.
continue this another time because we can
I
speak
agree.
about this
Yeah.
forever.
There's so many myths, but I also want to say as we close, I really appreciate what you are doing with astrology and what Ksenia. Before, I didn't understand the astrology and how powerful the planets are as they're moving through. Well, we can tell where they are based on the background stars, and where they are has an impact on us.
Mhm.
I never thought that planets, well, I did actually have some idea that planets would have an impact on us. I did write some blog posts about the impact of the planets, and the impact the moon obviously has an impact on it,
Oh yeah.
on the heads and everything. But astrology is so important. So I just now I realize even more, oh, retrograde Mars, that has an impact on me.
Oh yeah.
You know,
Oh
and
yeah.
and that's why uh, I'm I'm just saying, keep doing what you're doing and
Thank you.
discovering what you're
Same for you.
so important.
And I
Thank you.
will place link under this video. Your channel is called Undying Stars. People can see it under your image here, and also links will be under this video. Thank you so much, Dave. I hope we do this again because there's so much more to say. Thank you. I'm closing here. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.